I'm a feminist. I said this in matric to a visiting career guidance teacher. She looked at me disapprovingly and responded, "Already? So young." Unshaken by the slight sneer, I piped up, "Yes," with much pride and enthusiasm. I had discovered the word the year before, 1988, as a 15-year-old in high school. And I still delighted in this word and in its description of me in this way when I shared it with this guidance teacher, this visiting teacher who disapproved. And I discovered it in a conversation with a friend whose mother was in detention. And she'd said to me, "Well, they're feminists." And I said, "What's a feminist?" And in that conversation, I discovered a world of women who were able to make the most armed, militarized, organized, wealthy, violently patriarchal, white supremacist state quake in its boots. I loved the idea of these dangerous women who could scare the apartheid state. The apartheid state treated them as though they were dangerous. They were in detention, banned, censored, tortured. And so I began to associate what they did with danger, but also with power. And as this conversation continued about some of these women as feminists, whose thoughts, whose words, whose actions, whose possibilities scared this seemingly insurmountable, inconquerable state, I connected, because I am a child of the 70s and 80s. I connected with the slogans of the 80s. And when the slogans of the 80s were freedom in our lifetime, I thought about what it would mean to have these dangerous women creating a different world. Because freedom in our lifetime, as a friend of mine who's Black British would later, much later in my life, say to me, sounded a bit foolishly optimistic. To me, it said undeterred, stubborn optimism. And stubborn optimism has been something that's been very important to me in my identification as feminist. It's the optimism as much as it is the stubborn. Another slogan of the 80s, an injury to one is an injury to all. Solidarity, as chosen, as deliberate, as world-changing. The idea of women as those who could make the world, remake the world, fashion freedom, change the world, was exciting to me. And so there was delight as we continued in this conversation, because while I was discovering a world made and unmade and remade by women, I was also able to connect it to something else that I too was fluent in. As a little girl, I was a climber. I wasn't as graceful or as swan-like as my younger and older sister. I was clumsy, but I was a determined climber. I loved to climb everything. Trees, walls, poles, into cupboards. And almost every time I climbed, I fell. Yet something about climbing was utterly irresistible to me. And each time I climbed and fell, I was reminded that I was not acting like a girl. I also liked to sit, as I still do, in my private space, with my legs up against my chest. And here too, I would be reminded constantly to sit like a girl, properly folded into myself, uncomfortable. And so there was delight as I discovered this world of dangerous women who possibly were also like dangerous girls. The idea that it wasn't simply I and my friends who were uncomfortable in the cages built for girls, but a world of other willful girls in cities and countries and languages I didn't even yet know existed. And so I come to think of feminism as power, but as delight at discovering community, discovering a community of willful, joyful, powerful, boundary-breaking little girls and women all over the world. Today, you can walk into a department store in Johannesburg or Nairobi or Kampala or Cairo and buy a t-shirt that says, "The future is female," or just feminist. Celebrity culture tells us that feminism is trendy and sexy and beautiful and maybe even safe. Yet, all over our continent, there are lessons about how unsafe feminism continues to be. I'll tell you a story. Wambui Mwangi, sociology professor, who has returned from the US and lives in Kenya again for the first time in a long time, was recently successfully sued and obliged to pay the equivalent of a sizable mortgage and apologize to the sexual predator she had named and shamed. She had acted in solidarity with another Kenyan feminist, Shalja Patel. And so here we see that part of what is being criminalized, what they are being sued for, are those very things I found delight in: solidarity, community. Shalja Patel refused to apologize to her assaulter. She refused to mortgage her house to contribute to the tidy sum now due to this man. Wambui Mwangi continues to appeal this case. We'll see what happened. In another part of our continent, Stella Nyanzi is in jail for being a willful woman. Stella Nyanzi wrote a poem in which she wished that President Museveni, who has been in power for too long, had not been born. In her poem, she wished that Museveni's mother had killed him by suffocating him in her birth canal and not pushed him out of her vagina alive. In post-independence Uganda, using the word vagina, birth canal, when these are linked to the president's mother, is something you can go to jail for. Think about that for a minute. Stella Nyanzi, a vagina-having, mothering-choosing, unruly woman, is in jail for speaking about the president's mother's vagina. And interestingly, of course, the profanity, the crime, is because the offense is to the president. And so the president's mother's vagina and birth canal belong to the president. In an inversion that is common in all patriarchal societies. In all patriarchal societies, we use women's genitals as slur, as swear word. In Uganda, sometimes they are criminalized. And so it is interesting to sit today and to think about how easy and sexy and fashionable it is to be feminist. At the same time that clearly brutal states and groups across the world, I've simply talked about two, recognize still the danger and power and willfulness. But of course, part of what allows Wambui, Shalja, perhaps Stella, and perhaps Sylvia Tamale before her, who had been deemed and voted by one of the most popular dailies in Kampala, the worst woman in Uganda, and her response was to make a pin with worst woman in Uganda, which she proceeded to wear everywhere with delight for about 2 years. And so as we think very often about feminism as something difficult and painful, I often think about how energizing and how delightful it is to have women like Sylvia Tamale in the world. And I like to imagine that this delight is also perhaps what fuels the stubborn determination and the joy, even in the midst of allegations of newness, of the foreignness of willful women in the African context. When I see the RU reference list, I see traces on RU and the naked protests in the RU reference list. I see traces of the 1920s and the 1900s, Aba Women's War in Nigeria, those women who organize across class, across region, as women in defense of themselves, in defense of their capacity to make money and make decisions about their body. I see also how these languages of feminism that are both delightful and disruptive and about ownership travel to Kenya. And I know we often think about Wangari Maathai as the safe Nobel laureate. What we don't want to remember is the radical ecofeminist who was detained by Moi for protesting and insisting on public space as belonging to women, who stripped, like the students at RU reference list, and like them, she was criminalized. And yet, as we do the work of feminism in the world, as we create the delightful world we deserve, it helps to think about these circles and generations of women and feminists of different genders. Perhaps now at 47, unlike the little girl who declared at 15, when I declare that I'm feminist, perhaps my feminism is more complex. Perhaps it is simply more assured because I am today, in ways I was not at 15, fluent in the idioms that travel and allow women to speak and break free of the cage of gender. Perhaps I sit feeling the energy and the thoughts and the trouble-making deliciousness of radical African women's movements that are several centuries strong, not new, not third wave, not recent, but old, rooting, dangerous, but also delightful, allowing and enabling and lifting me, certainly, in stubborn optimism, because I do think on the worst day that I certainly deserve a free future. I think we all do. Free of these cages that have been centuries in the making, but also centuries in the unmaking. And so it is joyful to think of myself, to name myself at 47, many years later, several decades later, I am a feminist.